Russia has hundreds of jets. It has almost nowhere to fix the rarest ones. On the night of May 27th, Ukraine put a fire inside the single plant that keeps some of those aircraft alive, including the kind of plane Russia builds only a handful of and cannot quickly replace. Hit a runway and they pave it over in a week. Hit a hangar and they bolt a new one together. But hit the place that repairs what can't be bought off a shelf and you've done something that years of sanctions never managed to do. The Kremlin won't tell you how bad it is. The flight schedules over southern Russia will. And here's what makes that night different from 1,000 other strikes in this war. That plant wasn't the only target. It was one of four. Four sites hundreds of kilometers apart hid inside the same narrow window before sunrise. A command headquarters, an oil terminal, an air base full of bombers, and the quiet repair shop almost nobody noticed. To understand why all four went up together and why the smallest, dullest target may be the one that hurts most, you have to stop counting explosions and start counting something else entirely. Picture a map of the war from above. Not the front line, the rear. The deep rear, the place generals are supposed to feel safe. For most of this war, that rear was sacred. Ukraine fought for every meter on the ground in the east, while Russia struck its cities almost at will from a distance Ukraine couldn't answer. The geography was brutally simple. Russia was big, and most of what mattered to its war machine sat far beyond Ukraine's reach. Airfields, refineries, command posts. All of it tucked behind a wall of distance. And behind that distance, a wall of radar and missiles built up over decades. That wall is the whole story. Russia spent the Cold War and everything after it, learning one lesson above all others: layer your air defense until nothing gets through. Radar to see far, missiles to reach high, more radar to catch what slips low, layer upon layer until the sky over your important places becomes a roof. For a long time, that roof held. Then, slowly through 2024 and into 2025 and 2026, something shifted. Ukraine started reaching further, first with cheap long-range drones that could fly for hours on a lawnmower engine and a GPS chip. Then with Western cruise missiles, Storm Shadow fast and low and hard to track. And the strikes stopped being random pinpricks. They started looking like a campaign, a patient, deliberate effort to find the seams in that roof and pull them apart. The night of May 27th is where that campaign showed its full shape. Look at the 4 points on the map. Voronezh deep in central Russia, Taganrog on the Azov coast, Sevastopol on the southern tip of occupied Crimea, and Tuapse on the Black Sea coast in Krasnodar. Draw lines between them, and you get a shape that sprawls across hundreds of kilometers of Russian-controlled territory. Now imagine all four lighting up in the dark within minutes of each other. That is not a raid. A raid hits one place. This was a system being tested against itself, a single coordinated reach into 4 different pockets of the roof all at once to see if the roof could be everywhere it needed to be. According to reporting from Defense Blog, the scale and spread of the operation from Voronezh in central Russia to Crimea to the Krasnodar coast made it one of the most ambitious, simultaneous deep strike packages Ukraine has run in the entire war. Hold that word in your mind. Simultaneous. Because everything that follows turns on it, and it showed it on a budget that should worry Moscow more than any single fire. Some of the drones that flew hundreds of kilometers into Russia that night cost less than a family car. The cruise missiles cost more, but they're still cheaper than what they destroy. That's the quiet violence of this kind of warfare. You spend a little to threaten a lot. A drone built in a workshop forces the defense of a refinery that took decades and billions to build. When the cheap thing can credibly threaten the expensive thing, the whole arithmetic of who can afford to keep fighting starts to bend. And on May 27th, it bent toward Kiev. Let's walk the 4 targets the way the night actually unfolded. The strikes began in the dark hours before dawn and ran into the early morning. According to Ukraine's general staff, the operation targeted the radar and automated control systems of the Russian Air Force around Voronezh, Taganrog, and Sevastopol, the eyes and the wiring of Russian aviation in the south. Start with Sevastopol, because that's where the heaviest weapon landed. Around 5 in the morning, explosions rolled across occupied Crimea. According to the Ukrainian outlet Militarny and local telegram monitors, at roughly 0550 a missile struck a building on Hohol Street, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet's air arm. By morning, the building was, in the words of local channels reported by Euromaidan Press, badly burned, with not a single intact window left. Ukraine's general staff later confirmed Russian facilities in Sevastopol were hit with Storm Shadow cruise missiles. This matters for a reason. We'll come back to this. Wasn't a random office. After Ukraine wrecked the fleet's main headquarters back in 2023, this building had quietly become the primary command center. Now Voronezh, According to Defense Express, the strike there hit Baltimore Air Base, home of the 47th Aviation Regiment, and a nest of Su-34 fighter bombers. These are the aircraft that lob KA-B glide bombs into Ukrainian cities and frontline positions day after day. The local governor claimed his air defenses shot down 2 high-speed targets over the region. Note that carefully, even in Russia's own telling, things were getting through and the ones that did were fast. Then Taganrog, the plant at the center of our story. According to OSINT analysts, cited by Militarny and others, eyewitness footage filmed a couple of kilometers away showed smoke rising from the grounds of the 325th Aviation Repair Plant. Russian regional officials confirmed an attack and predictably claimed a missile was shot down. Whether the plant itself took serious damage is still not fully confirmed, and I want to be honest about that gap rather than paper over it. What's confirmed is fire and smoke on the site. What's not yet confirmed is how deep the wound goes. This was not Taganrog's first bad night, and that's part of why it matters. According to Defense Blog, a Ukrainian strike on Taganrog back in November 2025 destroyed a rare A-60, a one-of-a-kind laser-armed aircraft, while it sat undergoing work at the Beriev complex next door. In January 2026, Ukraine hit the Atlant Aerodrone factory in the same city. Ukraine has been circling this single patch of Russian aviation for months, learning it, mapping it, coming back. May 27th wasn't a first attempt. It was the latest move in a campaign that has clearly decided this corner of Russia is worth returning to. And finally, Tuapse. According to multiple monitors, Ukrainian drones struck the Tuapse oil terminal on the Black Sea coast. Footage shared by open-source trackers showed at least 2 drones hitting almost the same instant, with 3 separate fires breaking out across the facility. Tuapse is no small target. By Ukrainian accounting, it's one of the largest refineries in southern Russia, roughly 12 million tons of capacity a year, and its product feeds the Russian military. And this was not its first visit from Ukraine. It has been hit before. Russia knew it was a target. They defended it anyway, and the drones still got in. 4 sites, 1 window, each one defended, each one burning by sunrise. So now we can ask the only question that actually matters, not how. How is easy missiles and drones? The real question is why it worked. Why did one of the densest air defense networks on the planet catch so little on a night it should have caught everything? Here's the idea most people get wrong about air defense. They think it fails when it runs out of missiles. It doesn't. It fails long before that. It fails when it runs out of attention. An air defense network is not a wall. It's a decision machine. A finite number of radars, a finite number of launchers, and this is the part that's invisible from the outside, a finite number of human operators who can only track, prioritize, and engage so many threats at once. Feed that machine 1 missile, and it does its job beautifully. Feed it 1 missile from each of 4 directions, all arriving inside the same few minutes, and you force it to do the one thing it cannot do, be everywhere at the same second. That is what Ukraine engineered on May 27th. Not a harder punch. A smarter one. The cheap drones crawling toward Tuapse and Taganrog take hours to reach their targets. The storm shadows screaming toward Sevastopol take minutes. To make them all arrive together, you have to launch them apart, calculate each weapon's speed and route so that the slow ones and the fast ones converge on the same clock. That's not luck. That's arithmetic, run by an intelligence staff that has clearly learned to think in terms the West would recognize synchronized multi-domain deep strike. The doctrine of a serious military. There's a reason the weapon mix matters here too. A layered air defense is tuned to catch specific things at specific altitudes. High-flying ballistic threats get one set of sensors. Low-slow drones get another. Fast, low cruise missiles like Storm Shadow are among the hardest of all to track because they hug the terrain and give the radar almost no warning. Send only drones and the system adapts to drones. Send only missiles and it braces for missiles. But send both from multiple directions on the same clock, and you split the defender's attention across categories it can't cover with the same crew or the same battery. The mix isn't just firepower, it's a deliberate attack on how the roof was designed to think. And when every threat lands at once, the defender is forced into a cruel little equation. Which one do I save? You cannot cover Voronezh and Crimea and the Krasnodar coast with the same battery. You have to choose. And every choice means leaving something else naked. That is the overload. The radar wasn't blind. The operators weren't asleep. There were simply too many problems presented at the same instant for a system that was built to handle them one at a time. Now layer the targets themselves on top of that because Ukraine didn't pick 4 random dots. Look at what each one does to the body of the Russian war machine. The headquarters in Sevastopol is the head. It coordinates. It tells the planes where to fly and the ships where to look. Burn it and the fleet doesn't sink, but it stops moving together. Orders slow down. The left hand loses track of the right. You don't kill the body, you scramble the brain. The oil terminal at Tuops is the blood. Armies don't run on courage, they run on fuel. Every truck, every jet, every generator at the front draws on the supply that flows through places like Tuops. One fire doesn't win the war in a day. It does something slower and harder to reverse it, taxes every Russian operation that needs diesel and jet fuel to move. Bleed the supply, and the front feels it weeks later in convoys that don't arrive and sorties that don't launch. The airbase at Voronezh is a limb, the arm that throws the punch. Su-34s are the bombers actively hurting Ukrainian cities. Catching them on the ground breaks the arm that strikes. And then there's Taganrog, the dull one, the repair plant. This is the joint that lets a broken limb heal, and it's the most important target of the 4 precisely because it's the least dramatic. Here's why. A modern air force is not its number of planes. It's the rate at which broken planes become working planes again. Every jet that flies eventually breaks. Every engine has hours on it. Every airframe needs an overhaul. In a normal country, you ship that aircraft to one of many depots, and it comes back. But Russia is not a normal country anymore. It's a sanctioned one. According to multiple reports, the 325th plant in Taganrog is the sole Russian facility that performs major overhauls on the In-12 and In-72 military transports. It also services critical components for the IL-76 heavy lifter for the Tu-142, the Su-25, and most importantly, for the rare A-50 radar aircraft. And it shares a runway and production capacity with the Beriev complex next door, the only place in Russia that builds the A-50 at all. Sit with that for a second. The A-50 is Russia's Flying Eye, the radar plane that lets fighters and missile crews see deep and coordinate at range. Russia has only a handful of them. It has already lost some in this war. And it cannot simply order more because the factory and the repair line for the most specialized parts sit in the same vulnerable corner of the country that Ukraine just set on fire. This is the difference between a tactical strike and a strategic one. Knock out a runway, you've grounded planes for a week. Knock out the one place that can fix what money can't buy, and you haven't grounded planes for a week. You've started shrinking the total number of irreplaceable aircraft Russia will ever have again. Sanctions tried to do that for 3 years by cutting off parts. A single fire in Taganrog, if it bit deep, does it directly. Think about what that does to the math of attrition over time. In a war this long, the side that wins isn't always the side that destroys the most. It's the side whose losses come back fastest. A jet shot down is gone forever. But a jet that limps home with a cracked engine or shrapnel through a wing is only temporarily out of the fight if there's a depot to send it to. The repair line is what turns a damaged aircraft back into a threat. It's the difference between attrition that's permanent and attrition that's just a delay. Now choke that line. Suddenly, every jet that breaks isn't out for a month, it's out indefinitely, or it has to fly halfway across the country to the next available depot and wait in a queue behind everyone else who broke. The fleet doesn't shrink in a single dramatic loss. It shrinks slowly, invisibly, as broken planes pile up with nowhere to be fixed. That's why a repair plant is a strategic target dressed up as a boring one. You're not destroying aircraft, you're trapping them in a state of permanent disrepair. And against a sanctioned air force that already can't easily buy new airframes, that trap closes a little tighter with every plant you take offline. That's the exclusive logic of this whole operation, and it's worth saying plainly. Ukraine did not go after Russia's weapons that night. It went after Russia's ability to keep fighting. The head, the blood, the arm, and the cruelest cut the body's power to heal itself. Decapitate, bleed, break the limb. And then break the bone that lets the limb regrow. And return for a moment to that burned headquarters in Sevastopol because the head wound is subtler than it looks. Modern military coordination is not about one general barking orders. It's about a web of secure communications, data links, duty officers, and planning cells that turn raw radar tracks into decisions fast enough to matter. When you burn the building that houses that web, you don't necessarily kill the people they scatter to backups, to bunkers, to improvised command posts. But every one of those moves adds friction. Orders that took minutes now take longer. Information that flowed through one trusted hub now has to be rerouted through 3. In a war where a Ukrainian drone can reach a target in the time it takes to forward an email, that friction is not a minor inconvenience. It's the gap between intercepting a threat and reading about it in the morning. Decapitation doesn't stop the body. It just makes the body a half step slower, and half a step is everything. You don't measure a strike like that in explosions. You measure it in everything that quietly stops working in the weeks that follow. So where does this go? Let me lay out the possibilities. Honestly, then tell you where I'd put my own bet, and just as importantly, what would prove me wrong. Scenario 1. This was a spectacular one-off. Ukraine pulled together its best missiles, its best drones, and a perfectly timed plan fired its whole hand on one night and won't be able to repeat it at this scale for a long while. In this version, the damage is real but absorbable, and Russia patches the roof and moves on. Scenario 2. This becomes the new normal. Ukraine has cracked the method. Synchronized cheap and expensive weapons across vast distances to overload air defense by attention rather than firepower, and it can now run packages like this on a recurring basis against 4 or 5 targets a night, picking apart the rear at will. There's also a middle path worth naming because reality rarely picks a clean lane. It's possible Ukraine can repeat the method, but not the intensity that it can keep forcing Russia to choose just not every single night, and not always against the highest value targets. Even that middle outcome favors Kyiv, because the threat doesn't have to be constant to be expensive. It only has to be credible. A defender who knows the next saturation night could come at any time has to keep batteries spread thin all the time, paying the cost of the strike on the nights it doesn't even happen. Here's where I'd place my bet. The data leans towards scenario 2, not all the way, but past the midpoint. And the reason isn't the size of this strike, it's the structure of it. A lucky raid doesn't hit a command brain, a fuel artery, a bomber base, and the single irreplaceable repair plant on the same clock. That target list reflects planning, not improvisation, and the timing trick making slow drones and fast missiles converge together is a repeatable technique, not a one-time stunt. Once a military learns to think this way, it tends to keep thinking this way. If that's right, Russia walks into a choice no commander ever wants. It can pull air defense batteries back from the front to shield the deep rear, and weaken the very front line where the ground war is decided. Or it can keep its defenses forward and accept that its air bases, refineries, and repair shops will keep burning. There is no third door. You cannot defend everything when the enemy can choose where and when to make you choose. And watch the F-50 piece specifically. According to the verified facts, the repair and production line for those rare radar planes sits right where Ukraine just struck. If that plant is badly damaged, the A-50 and the strategic transports lose their maintenance home in the south and have to fly thousands of kilometers to depots deep inside Russia, which means fewer of them in the air, less often over the front. That matters. Now here's my escape condition, the thing that would tell you I'm wrong. I'm betting on a mechanism, not a date. If over the coming weeks Ukraine cannot repeat synchronized multi-target packages, if the deep strike nights go quiet or shrink back to single targets, then this was a peak, not a pattern, and scenario 1 was right. And the second tell watch for clear evidence on Taganrog itself. If satellite imagery shows the repair halls intact and Russian transport and radar flights over the south continue at their usual tempo, then the smoke was worse than the wound, and the most important cut of the night didn't land as deep as it looked. I could be wrong. But the shape of this strike says Ukraine wasn't trying to make a headline. It was trying to prove a method, and methods once proven get used again. So keep your eyes on 2 things in the days ahead. First, the calendar. If another 4 or 5 target night comes fast missiles and slow drones landing together across hundreds of kilometers, then you'll know the overload wasn't an accident. It was a doctrine. And the roof Russia spent decades building is now something it has to ration. Second, the smoke over Taganrog. If the rarest Russian planes start flying less from farther away, you're watching a body that can no longer heal itself in the place it always healed before. That's the signal. If I'm right, you'll see it before any government admits it. Share this with someone who still thinks this war is just about the front line, and subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown, because the next clear night over Russia may tell us which scenario we're really living in.